Hello and welcome to Voices of BlueScope, the podcast where we go behind the scenes at BlueScope to meet the people who create strength every day. I'm your host, Martin Feld. Thank you for listening. In this episode, we're featuring an audio-only version of a speech that Mark Vassella, BlueScope's Managing Director and CEO, made at the National Press Club of Australia, in which he explained how gas plays a unique and essential role in both manufacturing and the energy transition. Mark's address to an audience of key influencers and decision-makers across media, government and academia was also broadcast live on ABC TV and was delivered on behalf of Manufacturing Australia, a member group that represents 12 of Australia's manufacturers, all of which work with governments to support Australia's manufacturing sector. Now, let's shift to hear Mark's recorded address at the National Press Club.
Hello and welcome to the National Press Club of Australia for today's Westpac address. I'm Tom Connell, the club's president and an anchor at Sky News. Our guest today, Mark Vassella, BlueScope Managing Director and CEO. His address: Australian gas prices are costing us our manufacturing, jobs, energy transition and a future made in Australia. There are obviously a lot of different views on gas, but most seem to agree it belongs in the basket effectively of that old Irish joke about the best way to Dublin. You wouldn't start from here. Mark joined the company following BlueScope's 2007 acquisition of Morgan Steel Distribution. He's gone to the US and headed back to these shores during his time with the company, and he's been a director since January 2018. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mark Vassella.
Thanks, Tom, and thank you, everybody. Thank you to the National Press Club and Westpac as well. It's lovely to be here. So good afternoon, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to present to you today. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Ngunnawal people, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. So before I explain what I think's wrong with our public energy policy and propose options on how to fix it, let me tell you a real-life story, a cautionary tale of what happens if countries don't get their energy policy right. Earlier this year in April, one of BlueScope's raw materials team from Port Kembla Steelworks explained the following circumstance. "You're not going to believe what's just happened," they said. "One of our export coke shipments that was loaded several weeks earlier at Port Kembla is about to be placed under British Royal Navy escort." Now, coke's a raw material used in the iron and steelmaking process. Now, this naval escort didn't occur in some global maritime hotspot. This was in the UK waters as the ship approached the port city of Hull in England. The broader context was the owners of British Steel had stopped purchasing raw materials for the blast furnaces at the Scunthorpe Steelworks, and there was a considerable risk of irreversible damage to the furnaces if they ran out of coke. There was also a concern that the coke shipment from BlueScope would be redirected. The UK government passed emergency legislation to take control of British Steel and deploy the Navy to ensure the critically needed raw material arrived safely at the plant, allowing the blast furnace to continue to operate without damage. Now, coincidentally, at the time we were providing critical supplies of coke to British Steel, we were also providing urgent supplies of coke to the Whyalla Steelworks in South Australia. The backdrop to this situation is the terrible decline in the UK steel industry. Since the 1970s, UK steel production has fallen from 30 million tonnes per annum to just 3 million tonnes today. The UK was the fifth largest steel producer in the world. It's now ranked 26. A combination of high energy costs and environmental regulations have increased operating costs. UK power prices are 25% higher than the EU, crippling their competitive position. Massive overcapacity from China, trade restrictions, geopolitical tensions have distorted markets. And of the 6 steel companies still operating in the UK today, 4 of them are in administration or on a government assistance package. So that's a real life story. Sadly, the situation at Whyalla is equally as bleak, and BlueScope is leading an international consortium of steelmakers to ascertain if reindustrialisation of the region is possible. Ladies and gentlemen, Australian manufacturing is at a dangerous crossroad. If industry and government are smart enough to navigate these conditions, our manufacturing sector will remain viable and the federal government's future Made in Australia economic policy can be a reality. If we can't, we face a decline in manufacturing, similar to that which we've seen in the UK steel industry. The looming risk to manufacturing is the result of long-standing dysfunction in the domestic gas market and the lack of a fair gas price for Australian customers. So today, on behalf of all 12 members of Manufacturing Australia, I'm proud to officially launch Manufacturing Australia's campaign for fair gas prices. Now, in one sense, this campaign shouldn't be necessary, but unfortunately, manufacturing's been at the wrong end of 15 years of failed gas policies. We're calling on political and industry leaders to recognise the economic benefit that flows from our sovereign manufacturing capability and the potential to grow it if we have access to fairly priced gas and allow our manufacturers to compete internationally. Currently, manufacturers in the eastern states, New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, South Australia and Tasmania, face gas prices more than 3 times those of our main LNG competitors, the United States and Qatar. Despite massive gas reserves in Australia, one of the highest wholesale prices is here amongst producer nations. In 2024, Australian industry paid an average wholesale price of around $10.30 per gigajoule of gas. This compares to our LNG rivals, Qatar and the United States, at $2.20 and $3 per gigajoule respectively. Worse, the adoption of a pricing mechanism that is based on LNG export prices means that local gas users are effectively paying for export infrastructure they don't use. That's not right. It increases local gas prices and puts local gas users at a structural disadvantage. So just pause and think about that. Australian gas users are effectively subsidising the cost of gas going to countries we compete with as manufacturers. It's not unreasonable. In fact, it's our responsibility to challenge this and ask why. Why are we letting the unforeseen consequences of energy policy decisions made 15 years ago still distort today's more brittle and exposed domestic economy? So what's gone wrong? Let's get some facts on the table. While some conventional gas sources have lower production costs than the east coast of Australia, high domestic gas prices are caused by 4 key factors that have distorted the market and the demand and supply balance. Firstly, the massive increase in demand by LNG exporters to supply overseas customers that's come online in the past 10 years. Second, a declining output in east coast gas fields, especially the Bass Strait, which has underpinned east coast gas supplies for 60 years. Third, an unwillingness by state governments, particularly Victoria and New South Wales, to enable new gas field developments. This reduces the amount of gas that's available and makes development more costly. Just think of the difficulties of the Narrabri gas project. This behaviour is particularly egregious when those same governments want industry to decarbonise. They must understand that gas is fundamental to the decarbonisation journey. And fourth, a deliberately opaque market in which most gas is traded by confidential bilateral contracts, and LNG-based gas sellers have dominant negotiating power over local gas buyers. We now have the bizarre situation in the Eastern Australian market where over the past decade, domestic gas demand has fallen by over 20%. Volumes have increased massively, and yet gas prices have more than doubled. Worse, the Australian Energy Market Operator is forecasting shortages of up to 10% between 2029 and 2032, with this shortfall in gas increasing to 20 to 30% from 2033. That's less than 8 years away. And the forecast shortages only get larger as we move further into the 2030s. Unlike other commodities, gas touches every sector. It's a cost of living issue, a manufacturing issue, and a national energy security issue. Our jobs, our industries, and our energy independence all rely on it. No other commodity comes close. In terms of manufacturing, gas is critical for a wide range of industries. Industries that are represented here today by Manufacturing Australia, including your locally manufactured Ream hot water system, which is ironically a renewable energy store and made from Australian steel. Aluminium produced at Tomago in Newcastle and extruded into doors and windows by Capral with raw materials from Alcoa. Cement, that is the basis for construction and infrastructure, from Cement Australia. Fertiliser for our critical agricultural industry produced by Dyno Nobel. Paints, adhesives and fillers manufactured in some of the most advanced facilities in the world by Dulux. Wine bottles for our very important wine industry made by Aurora. Scrap metal that's recycled as part of the circular economy by Sims. The bricks and pavers for your home produced by Brickworks. Gyprock for your walls from CSR. And finally, and unashamedly, BlueScope's TrueCore steel framing and beautiful ColourBond roofing for your most important asset, the family home. Gas is essential for the manufacture and production of these products. Gas, unlike electricity, can be used to generate high temperature process heat that's central to these manufacturing processes. Gas generation, with its ability to provide dispatchable 24/7 power, is also crucial for the energy transition, along with other firming technologies such as batteries and pumped hydro. No modern economy can run without gas. Australia's chasing hard to meet its Paris Accord 2050 net zero targets, and our coal-fired generators are closing, while the level of renewable energy increases. A key role for gas is to provide firming power, and demand for this will only increase. Put simply, having gas in the grid allows us to build more renewables faster. Without gas, the energy transition will be delayed, and net zero targets become more difficult to achieve. South Australian Premier Malinauskas made the science, not socials point in determining our energy policy recently. With his state at 80% renewable penetration, he said, "Without gas, there's no firming of our electricity system, and without firming, there are no renewables. If we can't get gas prices down, electricity prices will also be higher, because gas generation often sets the marginal electricity price in the national electricity market." These are all issues governments are now grappling with. Letting the lights go out is not an option for an advanced and developed economy like Australia. Whether it's appreciated or not, gas must be part of the energy transition story. When it comes to gas, its ability to affect major reductions in CO2 emissions for existing industrial processes. Consider my own company. BlueScope's Port Kembla blast furnace makes 3 million tonnes of steel per annum. This steel goes directly into major infrastructure and Australia's building and construction industry, which employs around 1 million skilled workers and provides housing for hundreds of thousands of families each year. At Port Kembla, switching from the coal-fired blast furnace to gas-based direct reduced iron, or DRI, could lead to a 60% reduction in emissions, or 3.6 million tonnes of CO2 annually. By any measure, that's a material reduction in CO2 emissions for Australia. But to achieve this, BlueScope would need around 40 petajoules of additional gas annually. This represents about 8% of the current East Coast annual demand of approximately 500 petajoules. There are other enablers required to make such a transition at Port Kembla, but right now it just won't happen because the gas supply is not available and the gas price is unaffordable. Back to Whyalla in South Australia, where the steelworks is currently in administration. BlueScope is leading a consortium of some of the world's most innovative steelmakers. Korea's POSCO, Nippon Steel Corporation from Japan, and JSW Steel Limited from India. Together we're evaluating whether it's feasible to establish a new direct reduced iron plant, which we see as the most viable way to create a long-term sustainable operation and grow a new low-emissions iron export industry. Establishing such an industry is clearly in the national interest, but the highest hurdle will be access to adequate supply of affordable gas. And this is in a state with ample supplies in the Moomba gas fields. In short, the demand for gas is only set to grow, and so are the benefits it can bring to our economy and our environment. However, As we move forward, we need to face the reality that new, reliable sources of supply are urgently needed if we're to achieve our goals and not witness the deindustrialisation of our economy. Addressing this won't be easy. Government is having to fix a policy failure that's been allowed to exist for years. Vested interests in the global energy companies will resist change to the policy settings that should have been established from the start. So this makes it hard, but it's not impossible nor worth pursuing. In fact, the opposite. It's essential for our shared Made in Australia and decarbonisation goals. And it should not be beyond the intelligent people in government to design viable policies that work. Now, there's always a tendency for people to focus on someone or something else to blame. Some have accused the LNG industry of being the cause of what's happened, and that's not entirely fair. The global LNG companies have invested more than $60 billion in new facilities on the Australian East Coast. In the process, they've created a major new industry for Australia and thousands of jobs. We all welcome that. They did this based on the policy settings put in place by governments at the time. But the combined impact of increased LNG export demand, with tightening domestic supply, inadequate investment, plus a highly imperfect and non-transparent market, means the new LNG industry operates at the expense of long-established domestic customers like BlueScope and other critical Australian manufacturers. Rather than blaming the LNG sector or past governments, we're focused on solutions. A starting point is to understand how Australia allowed itself into this situation. Specifically, how did we become one of the world's largest exporters of LNG, providing the energy that our trading partners need, while effectively starving domestic industry of a key input, competitively priced gas that supports manufacturing? Armed with this understanding, we can begin to fix the deficiencies and the inequity of the current system and put in place solutions both immediately and in the long term so we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. Part of the answer, I'd argue, lies in the policy settings that were put in place. Put simply, on the East Coast, we're an international policy outlier. Compared to other major gas producers, whether it's the US, Canada, and even Western Australia, the East Coast Australian market stands out. It doesn't have a domestic gas reservation scheme in place, nor is there any form of export permitting. Addressing these two issues would go part way to fixing the problem. Now, to be really clear, no one is calling for contracts to be torn up, and the energy companies should desist from that deliberate line of obfuscation about sovereign risk. We understand the implications and importance of our reputation as a trading partner. Similarly, we should ignore the self-serving objections of overseas energy companies. The members of Manufacturing Australia and the thousands of their downstream customer businesses are calling for reservation for a proportion of newly contracted and recontracted gas and immediate reservation for all uncontracted gas. Immediate reservation of uncontracted gas would bring rapid relief for East Coast manufacturing businesses. In the medium term, if Australia reserved just 1/3 of its current East Coast gas production, it would be sufficient to meet expected residential and commercial demand, industrial decarbonisation needs, and gas peaking generation to help firm renewables. This would still allow 2/3 of East Coast gas production to be exported to meet contracts that support Australia's trading partners. What's also urgent and needs immediate focus, we need to bring on new gas supplies, particularly as current sources of supply diminish. Victoria and New South Wales need to start supporting new gas developments, whether it's Gippsland or Narrabri, again, as South Australian Premier Malinaskis called for recently. Beetaloo in the Northern Territory needs to be developed. Queensland should continue unlocking new gas fields. And the federal government needs to speed up regulatory approvals and support investment in gas pipelines and storage to get the gas where it's needed, when it's needed most. This is akin to building or upgrading our national highway network. Once new gas fields open and Australia's gas production increases further, the proportional domestic allocation would naturally be lower, and speeding approvals would lower the overall cost of new developments. A win-win if ever there was one. The federal government should also strengthen the Australian domestic gas security mechanism by enforcing the net contributor test for LNG projects. This is where LNG operators need to show they are making a net contribution to gas supplies, something they haven't done. Now to deal with the thornier issue. More than just accessing gas, we need it at prices that will allow our products to compete internationally. In our view, the additions to supply that would occur from redirecting uncontracted gas will not be enough to lower gas prices in the short to medium term to levels that would be viable for domestic manufacturers. New supplies and reservation as contracts expire will help, but they'll take time to come on stream. And unfortunately, that's time we don't have. Our analysis, confirmed by external experts, indicates that it should be possible to deliver gas to East Coast customers at well below $10 per gigajoule and still achieve reasonable returns on investment for gas companies based on their production costs. To deliver this outcome, there are several potential policy levers government could use. One option would be for the government to act as a group buyer of gas and then resell this gas to domestic users. With government effectively managing a book build, this would help to correct the current imbalance in bargaining power between gas sellers and buyers. Another option would be for government to place a small levy on LNG exports and recycle the revenue generated to reduce the cost of gas for domestic consumers. This approach could be applied on an equal basis or varied to achieve policy objectives. Now, these are without question major changes to current East Coast gas policy settings, but they're hardly revolutionary. If government was starting from scratch to design a gas policy today, international experience suggests a price mechanism would be part of that policy. For example, the United States has an export permit system that provides a public interest test should exports leave the domestic market short or prices too high. The EU imposed a gas price cap in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine to reduce gas prices and volatility. Qatar and Malaysia had volume reservation and dual pricing systems with discounted pricing for domestic users. And India and Indonesia have price caps. The difficulty is that the government's not starting from scratch. But just because it's harder to do now doesn't mean that it's good policy. Major change is required to fix our broken gas market and reinstate a fair domestic price. Again, compared to other international exporting countries, we are a policy outlier. Now, unless these decisions are taken, then the country runs the very real risk of seeing what's left of our manufacturing industry shut down. We need to reflect on what that means. As COVID showed us, there are some industries where we need to maintain a sovereign capability. Put another way, there are some industries where their value is far greater than just their output. We could call these strategic industries, those which are essential for any functioning economy. Steel, aluminium, cement, bricks, fertiliser, critical minerals, petrochemicals, food, fibre and packaging are among these. Without them, Australia runs the very real risk of being dependent on supply chains that could be under threat at any time. We know the consequences of failed energy policy on domestic manufacturing. Think Germany and other parts of the EU that are grappling with the consequences of energy policy decisions made over the last decade and a willingness to tie themselves to Russia. They're now in the midst of a major deindustrialisation, and the economic and social consequences are only just starting to be felt. I'm pretty sure no one here today wants to choose that. An important question is, what sort of future economy do we want to have? The recently returned federal government has made it clear our future needs to include a vibrant manufacturing sector. And Australia has what's required to fulfil that ambition. We lead the world when it comes to almost every commodity and resource. We shouldn't be embarrassed by this. In fact, we need to leverage it. After all, it's what's underpinned our amazing standard of living. But we can't be complacent. While the rest of the world will keep demanding our commodities, other suppliers are emerging, especially in Latin America and Africa. That's why we need to be thinking ahead. What can we do to meet demand for manufactured products where their inputs are the raw materials which we have in abundance? Products like low emissions iron that use our critical iron ore resource and gas. This is the opportunity the government is trying to address with a future made in Australia. But today, our current manufacturing industry is under threat from a restricted supply of affordable gas. This is a problem, but one that can be resolved with sound policy underpinned by clear, longer-term thinking. It's an opportunity for us to set up our industrial future. Governments have done this before, lent into major structural reform for the greater good of the economy and the country. Paul Farrow, the National Secretary of the Australian Workers' Union, said of Treasurer Jim Chalmers' recent productivity roundtable, "There won't be a reform put on the roundtable that would create a bigger or faster boost to productivity than an East Coast gas reservation system. Decoupling our East Coast gas market from our exports is key to restoring the sustainable gas prices we lost a decade ago." The manufacturing companies represented here today have been operating and innovating in Australia and beyond for decades, some for more than 100 years. We employ more than 100,000 people directly and indirectly, operate in 30 countries and export to more than 50. It's an incredible level of achievement and resilience. And as manufacturers, we've survived and done that by focusing on the bottom line. Well, the bottom line is a future made in Australia depends on affordable gas being available for Australian industry. No gas, no future made in Australia. That's why I'd invite you and encourage you to support Manufacturing Australia's campaign to deliver fair gas prices for all Australians. So thank you for your time today, and I appreciate your attention. Thank you.
That concludes this podcast instalment. If you'd like to learn more about what you just heard, you can find links in the show notes for this episode in your browser or podcast app, including further details about the Fair Gas Prices campaign, a dedicated photo album of the event, and both a full video version of the speech and a highlight clip in which Mark recounts the significance of the day. Thank you for listening to the Voices of BlueScope podcast. We hope to have you again soon.